Welcome to Art 305, Art and Mass Culture, Chapter 5, Photography, Part 2. The relationship between photography and art. During the period between 1839 and 1905, Western artists struggled with this question, directly and indirectly. Their struggle generated two opposing kinds of response. One, that of academic painting, used perspective to create an art that imitated the optical realism of photography. The other, avant-garde art, broke with the perspective tradition and began to create new artistic languages that ultimately opened up new views of reality as well as new forms of art. The photography as art debate in the 19th century. Some felt that photography should share the ambitions of academic art. In 1861, British critic Jabez Hughes urged photographers to abandon the goal of simply recording the world as it was and instead create images with the elevated goal of depicting beauty and moral good. Hughes and many like him felt that photographic compositions had to be set up and photographic negatives aesthetically manipulated in order for the medium to enter the terrain of fine arts. High art. Art that carries a moral message. Hughes suggested that photography be divided into three classes. The first would be mechanical photography, which was a literal or exact depiction, using photography to make a record of what we see in nature. The second category was called art photography, in which the photographer is not happy with reality or nature as he or she sees it, and so makes changes to the scene to make it more appealing or beautiful. The third category was a high art category in which the photographer was trying to instruct, purify, or ennoble the viewer. So it had a higher moral connotation to it. Hughes wrote, "Hitherto photography has been principally content with representing truth. Can its sphere not be enlarged? And may it not aspire to delineate beauty too? Photographers need to produce pictures whose aim is not merely to amuse, but to instruct, purify, and ennoble." The artist Julia Margaret Cameron. Julia Margaret Cameron created elaborately staged and costumed pieces that speak the artistic idiom of British academic painters of her day. She arranged friends and family members into tableaux vivants inspired by great works of literature, such as Alfred Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King. She also created scenes from religion and mythology, with her nieces posed as angels and muses. Their poetic quality heightened by her use of soft focus, Cameron's photographs have a melancholy beauty that continues to appeal to modern viewers. And here's a picture of one of her nieces posing with angel wings. A quote from Julia Margaret Cameron from a letter that she wrote to Sir John Herschel. She says, "My aspirations are to ennoble photography and to secure for it the character and uses of high art by combining the real and ideal and sacrificing nothing of truth by all possible devotion to poetry and beauty." And this is the parting of Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. So this is one of her tableaux vivant or living picture scenes. And this is another from the Idylls of the King. This is Vivian and Merlin. And in this picture, her husband is playing Merlin. So she got her friends and her family members to pose for these photographs. And then finally, The Whisper of the Muse, in which the male artist or a violin player, the musician, is inspired by the whisper of the female muse. And this reinforces that gender disparity in which men are the doers and women are behind the scenes. All right, we're moving on to our second artist, Nadar, and this is a self-portrait that he made in 1855. Another incredible portrait photographer is named Nadar. He was born with the name Gaspar Felix Turnisham, but he took a professional name that we know him by today, Nadar. Nadar was part of a bohemian circle of writers and artists that settled in Paris during the Second Empire. Born into a family of printer tradespeople of radical leanings, young Nadar became interested in many of the era's most daring ideas in politics, literature, and science. Nadar was a great entrepreneur and a businessman and a great advertiser. He opened a popular photography studio in 1853, and he began doing portraiture in his studio. He took pictures of famous people to promote himself. Just like today, he got associated with famous people, and the fame rubbed off on him. Ever open to new ideas and discoveries, Nadar was the first in France to make photographs underground using artificial light from batteries, and the second to photograph Paris from the basket of an ascendant balloon, so a hot air balloon. A quote from Nadar, he says, "The theory of photography can be learned in an hour, and the elements of practicing it in a day. What cannot be learned is the sense of light, an artistic feeling for the varying luminosity. What can be learned even less is the moral grasp of the subject, that instant understanding which puts you in touch with the model, helps you to sum him or her up, guides you to his habits, his ideas, and his character, and enables you to produce not an indifferent reproduction, a matter of routine or accident, but a really convincing and sympathetic likeness, an intimate portrait." And this is one of his intimate portraits of Charles Baudelaire. How are celebrity, fame, and photography related in Nadar's photographs? With Nadar's photographs of artists, writers, and actors, we see the start of the symbiotic relationship between photography and celebrityhood. Symbiotic means that one thing can't exist without the other. You really can't have a well-known celebrity without knowing the face of the person. And to do that, you need an inexpensive way to circulate the image of the person. Sarah Bernhardt was one of the first great celebrities. She was a famous actress. And both Nadar photographed Sarah Bernhardt, and both Nadar and Sarah Bernhardt bring something to the image. Nadar places her in front of a dark, plain backdrop. This focuses attention directly on Sarah Bernhardt with no distractions. She poses by turning toward the camera, yet she doesn't look directly at the camera. She allows the viewer to gaze upon her uninterrupted. Her head is at an angle, and her hand is up to her face. Nadar controls the image by lighting Bernhardt in a certain way. The light falls over her in a certain way. He uses the subtle gradations of light and dark, which photography is so good at, to his advantage. And the other thing that he or she do very intentionally is that they drape her in a cloth, right? So she's really not dressed. She's not wearing a dress, but she's wearing something that's kind of wrapped around her body. And so that again allows the viewer to have, a certain fantasy, right, that she's not wearing anything underneath that cloth. All right, there she is again. The public responded enthusiastically to such portraits of famous people. In 1855, at Paris's Great Industrial Exposition, there were scores of such photographs of the rich and famous. Such a response is easily recognizable today. The photograph had created the celebrity. As photo historian Giselle Froen notes, at the exposition, the public gathered around the numerous photographs of important and famous people. Today, it is hard to comprehend the impact of seeing for the first time, before one's very eyes, the personalities one had only known and admired from afar. And here are some of Nadar's views of Paris. So he was the first person to take a camera up in a hot air balloon and to photograph the city. Today we would do that from a drone, but he did that from a hot air balloon. And we'll learn about this in a minute, but this is called a carte-de-visite. So this is a single photograph that people could purchase of this view of the city. Nadar was a pioneer of aerial photography. In 1856, he took the first pictures from a hot air balloon. This demonstrates his promotional genius. There was a fad in Paris at that time for hot air balloons. And so you could go up and see Paris from a hot air balloon. You get to see everything. So Nadar got the idea to photograph from a hot air balloon. And during the siege of Paris, Nadar administered airmail service via balloon so that Paris could continue to communicate with the rest of France. And again, there's another, he's written in with a pen, the streets, to help people recognize it. And he also puts in the little bottom of the basket, right? This kind of a little reminder that this was taken from a hot air balloon. So again, he had a lot of self-promotion. He was a marketing genius. And there he is. He takes a picture of himself in his studio. Now, of course, he is not actually up in a hot air balloon, but he set this up in his studio with a backdrop of clouds to make it look like he was. And this is a caricature that was created by Daumier, a famous caricaturist, of Nadar. And there he is up in his hot air balloon, and his hat's flying off. And you can see that Daumier is also kind of lampooning the way that photography has taken over. Every other building looks like it has a photography studio in it. Daumier creates a caricature of Nadar up in his balloon, taking aerial photographs of Paris. Daumier is making a number of jokes in his cartoon. First, he's lampooning the French fad for hot air ballooning. Then he is poking fun at the huge number of photography studios that are in business at Paris. Look at the signs on the buildings below the balloon's basket. Finally, Daumier is making a point about the tremendous debate in the French art establishment about whether or not photography should be considered an art form, or whether it was just a mechanical technology. In other words, was it just the camera making the image, or was it really an art form with the artist making the image? Although photography is not made by the hand of the artist in the same way that painting is, it still requires many artistic and creative decisions to make a great photograph in the same way that it does to make a great painting. And this is these are just another view of the sewers of Paris. So Nadar was also the first person to, he had these big batteries that caused a kind of a spark of light, and he was taking pictures of the sewers. He experimented with artificial light, making the first photographs of the Paris sewers using a carbon arc lamp powered by Bunsen batteries. And there's another picture of the sewers. So again, this is fairly routine for us, but if you think about the first person who actually had the thought, oh, I'm going to take my camera down into the sewer and make a photograph. He also photographed the catacombs, which are under the city of Paris, where many people from the medieval times are buried. Now, that's actually a mannequin. That's not a real person. Because the exposure time was a little bit too long. And there you go, another picture of the catacombs. All right, so we're moving on to Anna Atkins and the cyanotype process. The plant image by Anna Atkins projects the feeling of mystery in the idea of nature, literally pressing its mark onto the photographic plate. In the 1840s and 50s, Atkins used the cyanotype photographic process to make numerous images of botanical specimens. Atkins' images are quite simple, yet the delicately outlined network of branches reveal detail unreachable by human art. For modern viewers, even after a century and a half of photography, each plant still seems to have an almost miraculous presence in the photograph. It is somehow made visible, as Daguerre said, quote, by nature herself. We consider Anna Atkins to be one of, if not the first, woman photographer. She was in a unique position to learn these photographic techniques. She was the daughter of a British scientist. And Anna received a scientific education from her father, which was very unusual for a girl at that time. And this put her in the unusual position to have a career in the sciences as a woman in the 1800s. She became a scientific illustrator. She drew pictures of shells to illustrate a book cataloging all different kinds of shells. Her father was a friend of both Sir John Herschel and William Henry Fox Talbot, our early inventors of photography. So Anna was aware of the advances in photography that both of those men were involved in. And she used Herschel's cyanotype process to illustrate a book about British algae. She made photograms. What is a photogram? A photogram is a cameraless photograph in which the object being photographed, so in this case the flower, is placed directly on the photographic paper and exposed to the sun. Or today you could use a UV lamp or light. You can watch a short 2-minute video on the cyanotype photogram process on YouTube. All right, moving on to the carte-de-visite, mass media and the image of the self. The carte-de-visite, and you can think of this as a visiting card. So it's in French, the word carte-de-visite, but you could also think about it as a visiting card. People use them kind of like we use business cards today. This experience quickly became more democratic. In the 1850s, the Paris photographer André Disdry patented a process for producing small 2.5 by 4-inch photographs, kind of like passport photographs today. This was an inexpensive standardized format that enabled lower middle class people to have their pictures taken. This was perhaps the most important impact of photography. Everyone got into the picture. Now, for a reasonable sum of money, a member of the economy-minded petite bourgeoisie, or lower middle class, could satisfy his desires to both emulate the rich and preserve his image for posterity. Photography not only put every man and woman, at least potentially, into the picture, it also gave the individual control over his or her presence in the picture for the first time. Presence in pictures had always been a sacred royal or aristocratic privilege, or a privilege of the wealthy, that in each case implied or asserted a correspondingly important role in the social and or cosmic hierarchy. So before photography, if you could afford to have a picture painted of yourself, you definitely were up higher in the social hierarchy. With photography, however, everyone assumed a presence of potentially equal importance. In other words, almost everyone could go out and have a photograph made of themselves. All right, so let's look at the theoretician Roland Bart. A photographic portrait inspired French philosopher Roland Bart to write his last and most popular book, which is called Camera Lucida. Bart was struck by a photograph of Napoleon's youngest brother and realized, I am looking at eyes that looked at the emperor. His fascination with the image led Bart to investigate the nature of photography. He concluded that the essence of the photographic image was what he termed the that has been. He said, quote, in photography, I can never deny that the thing has been there. There is a superimposition here of reality and of the past. It is reference, which is the founding order of photography. What I see has been here. The past is captured in photography. The dead live again. Many of us, like Bart, are fascinated by photographs of dead people. Although actually absent, they have a presence in the image. Photography as icon, pictures of the enlarged humanity of culture. Photography moved on and increased its scope and its ability to record detail, decade by decade, throughout the 19th century. Everyone, through photographs, could see the Alps, the Nile, the Amazon. Exotic glimpses of China, Africa, and the Near East both startled and amused European viewers. Wealthier individuals found themselves in a whole new kind of picture, the tourist snapshot, in which nature and history posed as the background for the proud individual featured as the central attraction. Let's look at the philosopher Craig Owens. But as American critic Craig Owens reminds us, representation, then, is not, nor can it be, neutral. It is an act, indeed the founding act, of power in our culture. When 19th century Europeans traveled to other continents to photograph the people and places, they were not innocent of European beliefs and values. The 19th century was a time of European colonial control throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The colonizing impulse reflected in their image-making practices has a long history, as can be seen in Spanish Casta paintings. All right, so let's talk about Spanish Casta paintings. When Spain conquered Mexico in the early 16th century, it established a colony that became increasingly racially mixed. The Native American peoples, already remarkably diverse in themselves, married and had children with Spaniards, with Africans who had been imported as slaves, and with immigrant Asians. In order to effect bureaucratic control of the mestizo, or mixed population, the Spaniards developed a system of castas, which we would call castes or classes, ranked according to racial mix. And here you can see these paintings were shown in a grid and actually ranked who was at the top of the social hierarchy and who was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. There was also a very specific structure that was bestowed on the genre, as Casta paintings were presented most commonly in a series of 16 individual canvases or a single canvas divided into 16 compartments. The series usually depicts a man, woman, and child, arranged according to the hierarchies of race and status, the latter increasingly represented by occupation as well as dress by the mid-18th century. The genre reveals more about prejudices in Spain at the time than the reality in Mexico, presenting, quote, an idealized Mexico where people of African, European, and indigenous heritage were intermingling in seeming harmony. And again, here are some of the Casta paintings that are owned by the Los Angeles County Museum of Arts. If you would like to select a Casta painting for your final presentation, choose from one of these images from the LACMA collection. And you can use this as your image from the textbook. So pick one of these four. This is a Miguel Cabrera, and then we have these three Ruiz images. So if you want to use one of these for your final presentation as your image from the textbook, select one of these four pictures. The most highly ranked and privileged of the 16 classes or castes, of course, were the Spaniards themselves. And the darkest, least European people had the least status and the fewest rights in the society. Spanish artists codified this cultural hierarchy in Casta paintings that configured the permutations of racial mix across a grid. Each possible pairing, say an Indian man and an African woman, was portrayed with their offspring in appropriate clothing for their class. Often they were shown performing what were considered appropriate tasks. Casta paintings were some of the first systematized depictions of racial categories. They reflected institutionalized prerogatives aligned according to racial stereotyping. However, they also offer us a view of members of society that we don't often get a chance to see depicted in artworks, and the subjects are represented as loving family groups. When you see these paintings, what are your thoughts about current social representations of mixed race people compared to the Casta paintings from the late 1700s? And you can also watch this short Art 21 video by artist Inigo Manglano Ovalle, in which he discusses the impact of seeing Casta paintings and what the impact that it had on him as a child. Sorry for mispronouncing his name. These Art 21 videos are excellent resources of potential information for your final presentations. All right, so we're moving on now to the photographer Louis Hine. Louis Hine was trained as a sociologist and taught social reform at Columbia University in New York City. In 1904, he began taking photographs of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island and living in poor neighborhoods. Hine joined the National Child Labor Committee, the NCLC, to reform child labor laws in factories, mines, canneries, and mills. Soon he was publishing what he called photo stories to support the NCLC goal of passing protective legislation against child labor. Along with his photographs, Hine collected and documented specific information about the children, convinced that knowing the names, ages, time on job, injuries on job, etc., made the images more credible to readers. He wrote of his photo essays and didactic collages, with a picture thus sympathetically interpreted, what a lever we have for social uplift. Hine's strategy worked. His images helped mobilize the public, and the reform legislation passed. According to photo historian Robert Hirsch, Hine exposed the myth that everyone could pull themselves up by their bootstraps and succeed in America. He laid open the fable of consumerism, in which people enjoyed mass-produced products without considering their negative repercussions. The sweatshops, the dangerous working conditions, unemployment, and pollution. And this very valid issue is still a challenge for us today. All right, so this is a poster that Louis Hine produced containing his photographs and text, and it's called Making Human Junk from 1915. And you can watch this 6-minute video, how Louis Hine's photos helped shed light on child labor in the United States. It's really interesting. All right, we're moving on to another photographer who went by the nickname Weegee. New York photojournalist Arthur Felix was so skilled in being on the spot at crimes and other news events that he was given the name Weegee after the Ouija board game that ostensibly gave psychic powers to the players. He encouraged the supernatural implications of his nicknames, writing, quote, "My camera was my life and my love, my Aladdin's lamp." Weegee photographed at night using bright, harsh flashes to illuminate everyone from a group of drunks passed out in an alley to a pair of elderly sophisticates emerging from a theater. His photographs functioned as pictorial assault, wiping the veneer off the city and stripping people of their pretenses. And here is one of his very famous photographs called The Critic from 1943. You can see the two socialites and the very drunk woman who is yelling at them. The Critic is the second name Weegee gave to this photograph. He originally called it The Fashionable People. In an interview, Weegee's assistant Louis Liotta later revealed that the picture was entirely set up. Weegee had asked Liotta to bring a regular from a bar in the Bowery section of Manhattan to the season's opening of the Metropolitan Opera. Liotta complied. After getting the woman drunk, they positioned her near the red carpet where Weegee readied his camera to capture the moment seen here. "It was like an explosion," Liotta recalled. "I thought I went blind from the 3 or 4 flash exposures." With that flash, Weegee captured the stark juxtaposition of the fabulous wealth and dire poverty in a gotcha style that anticipated the commercial appeal of paparazzi decades later. The photo appeared in Life magazine under the title The Fashionable People, and the piece let readers know how the woman's, quote, entry was viewed with distaste by a spectator. Later, the critic was revealed to have been staged, but that did little to dampen its influence. All right, moving on to from someone who was known to be very cynical to someone who was known to be very compassionate and empathetic, and that's Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange had a quote from an English philosopher nailed to her San Francisco studio door. It said, quote, "The contemplations of things as they are, without substitution or imposition, without error or confusion, is in itself a nobler thing than a whole harvest of invention." Her realistic photographs can be seen as noble contemplations of things as they are, their very nobility demanding intense viewer consideration. During the Great Depression, which started with the stock market crash of 1929, Lange was employed by the Farm Security Administration, which you often see abbreviated as the FSA, to visually document, the unemployed and other forgotten people of the distressed times. The FSA hired numerous photographers, but the enduring icon of the FSA photographic project is Lange's migrant mother, Nipomo, California, from 1936. Known as the Madonna of the Depression, Lange's Nipomo, California 1936 photograph depicts Florence Thompson, an Oklahoma-born woman of Native American heritage, with her 3 daughters. As art historian Francis Pohl asserts, images of mothers and children were common among FSA photographers, for they were perfect symbols of endurance in the face of disaster. And so here's that very famous photograph, and the 2 daughters are kind of burrowing their heads against her shoulder, and then the 3rd daughter is a baby here in her arms. And you can see her very worried expression, so I'm sure everyone is familiar with this photograph. All right, and we're moving on to another process. So this is another technology process that is affected the mass media distribution of art, and this is called the halftone process. The photograph becomes a mass media icon. Throughout most of the 19th century, photographs were not directly reproduced in mass media publications. Instead, woodblock prints were made from photographs, and the woodblocks were used to illustrate newspapers and magazines. Matthew Brady's famed portrait of Lincoln was translated into a woodcut to illustrate the cover of Harper's Illustrated Weekly. The woodcut artist reversed the image and elaborated the background. Such changes altered the visual information conveyed by the image, situating Lincoln in an upper-class environment instead of the more modest photographer's studio, no doubt enhanced the appeal of his portrait. And so here on the left, you can see this is Matthew Brady's photographic portrait of Abraham Lincoln right before he won the election. And then you can see how when they printed it in this magazine, which was called Harper's Illustrated Weekly, it was a very famous magazine, they could not at this time print the photographs, so they had to make a woodblock. They hired an artist, and you can see that the artist reverses his position and makes the background much more fancy. And this is from 1863, so this is, right before the U.S. Civil War. All right, the halftone process. Woodcut translations of photographs were not the only way such images were incorporated into the mass media. The halftone dot technique had been used to print limited numbers of photographs since the 1880s, but the standardization of the halftone process meant that photographs could be printed in newspapers and magazines more easily than the printed etchings and engravings of the 19th century. By 1905, major metropolitan newspapers were printing halftone dot photographs on a regular basis. the halftone dot process broke down a photographic image on a metal plate into a series of dots. Since each dot carried ink, it was the size of the dots in each area of the image that determined the blackness of that area. The distribution of various sizes of dots corresponded to the different shades of black and gray in the original photograph. The dots were still clearly visible in the newspaper photographs until the advent of digital photography and the updated computer printing technologies changed the format in the late 20th century. When the dots appeared in 1905, they caused a technical and iconic revolution. When the photograph began to replace artists' hand-drawn woodcuts and other prints as the dominant mass media image, it created a change in public expectations as dramatic as the changes brought about by the introduction of perspective woodcuts in the illustrated books of the 15th century. And this might be another interesting topic for your final project. The man who most clearly understood and applied the visual and the mythic possibilities of the modern newspaper illustrated by halftone photographs was William Randolph Hearst. There is a significant difference in impact between a 19th century newspaper illustrated with woodcuts and the front page of Hearst's New York Daily Mirror with its patchwork of photographs. Under Hearst, the halftone photograph began to compete in importance with the printed words themselves. Hearst began a process that would eventually end today with new meaning for most pictures of the news on television. By 1905, Hearst papers served the same audience that was flocking to the movies, the mass of urban workers and immigrants. All right, and so now we're going to look at the work of another philosopher, Walter Benjamin, who wrote an important paper essay called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. With the arrival of inexpensive mass media photography, the public, even if they disliked paintings outside the academic realist tradition, at least began to see them reasonably accurately. Today, most people see most of the art they, quote, know in reproductions of newspapers, magazines, and books, and of course, digital reproductions on the internet. Only a very small portion of the populace sees original artworks on a regular basis. As early as the 1930s, German critic Walter Benjamin began to consider how viewing art in reproduction changes the nature of the viewing experience. So if you go and see a painting in a museum, how is that different than seeing a picture of that painting in a book? Benjamin discussed, who we discussed briefly in the preface, noted that traditional art, experienced directly and often as part of a ritual, had a certain what he called aura of authenticity. Art in the age of mechanical reproduction, argued Benjamin, loses that aura. He saw photography as pivotal in the transition from art with aura to art without it, suggesting that early 19th century photographic portraits were, quote, the last refuge for the cult value of the picture. Benjamin was Jewish, so a Jew who was speaking against the rise of fascism. So at the time he was writing, he was very opposed to the rise of fascism. Benjamin was understandably concerned. The instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. So he felt that if you see art in the form of a photograph, it really changes it, and it starts to be about not a ritual, but about politics. If Benjamin was correct, then the 19th century invention of photography initiated a sea change in the history of Western image making. A change from images whose aura is inherent in their ritual context to images created primarily to convince or persuade, which we would call propaganda. Since Benjamin, art criticism has been largely divided between critics who believe that all art is political and those who focus on disinterested aesthetic issues, bemoaning any political agenda on the part of artists. The same divide can be seen among image makers. While many 20th century artists use photography in an overtly political works, others produce works that deny any political affiliation. This contrast can be explored in the works of two artists who, as it happens, were also lovers, Tina Modotti and Edward Weston. Tina Modotti. Italian-born Tina Modotti worked in Los Angeles as an actress and a model before she traveled to Mexico City at the height of the Mexican Revolution. She lived and worked with modernist photographer Edward Weston, but she rejected his strictly formal approach to create photographs that are laden with content. Like Hine and Lange, Modotti used photography as an effective tool to support her social reform agenda. Her elegant, sympathetic portrayals of urban laborers and the rural poor can be seen as part of the new type of ethnic social consciousness, which would change not only how photographs looked, but who was making them. Modotti became a member of the Mexican Communist Party, and she later gave up photography to become a full-time political activist. And here you can see she creates this image, and each of these objects has a very specific political meaning. So the sickle for communism, the bandolier, the bullets for reform, and the guitar, because many of the people that she was in the lower class that she was wanting to protect did not read, and so they would sing, and a lot of the information was transferred by song. All right, and so now we're gonna contrast Tina Modotti's very political use of photography. She, worked on behalf of people in the lower classes. She was a member of the Mexican Communist Party. We're going to contrast that with her lover for a time, Edward Weston. Weston eventually left her in Mexico and came back to Carmel. Edward Weston began his career with soft focus images related to the 19th century art photography of practitioners like Julia Margaret Cameron. In the 1920s, he set up a portrait studio in Southern California in Glendale, where he began a remarkable series of photographs of nautilus shells. Weston made extraordinarily long exposures of the shells, creating lush, velvety black backgrounds and luminescent surfaces on the shells. His later close-ups of vegetables, like bell peppers and artichokes, are sensuous explorations of sensual shape in radiant light. Weston photographed sand dunes and his lover's body with the same formalist skills. He described his work as purist, writing in his journal, quote, "The camera should be used for a recording of life, for rendering the very substance and quintessence of the thing itself, whether it be polished steel or palpitating flesh. I feel definite in my belief that the approach to photography is through realism." Weston sought that aura effect that Walter Benjamin found missing in the art of mechanical reproduction. But in doing so, he was oblivious to the political implications of treating his lovers' bodies exactly as he treated polished steel. In fact, some people say that his pictures of vegetables are more sensual than his pictures of his nudes, his lovers. All right, and here you can see this very romantic depiction of these two shells nestled in each other. Okay, and we're going to move on to new directions in photography. Since Modotti and Weston, artists have continued to use photography to expand the formal qualities of the medium and to present challenging, often politically charged content. They have also used photography to question the nature of visual representation itself. In doing so, they have looked at the body and concepts of beauty, at stereotypical images of sexuality and racial identity, and at the use of photographic imagery in global struggles for power. Eleanor Antin, Decades after Weston presented women's bodies as sculpted objects, Eleanor Antin did a series of photographs that very deliberately treated her own body like an object. Antin's carving, a traditional sculpture, this is made in 1972, is comprised of 72 self-portraits documenting the artist's weight loss of over a period of several months. So she went on a diet, and as she began to lose weight, she took pictures of herself. In a pose that strangely echoes photographs taken for criminal identification, the artist stands nude in a harshly lit room, pressing her back against a closed white door. The changes in Antin's shape that took place gradually over time are presented together, telescoping a lengthy occurrence into one of immediate visual perception. Antin's images force the viewer to consider the various ways that women alter their physiognomies, not just dieting and exercise, but also plastic surgery, which transforms the material body into a visual medium and into a sign of culture. A wry comment on the objectification of the female body, which has been used as subject matter by so many male artists, just like Weston. Antin's piece called Carving employs photography for conceptual rather than purely formal goals. And here she is, you can see her, she photographed herself from the front, the back, and each side, and she did it over time, so, each week as she photographed herself, she lost more and more weight. So she's comparing herself to a sculpture. And interestingly, she fairly recently, within the last 5 years, redid this, again photographing herself nude, but when she was in her 80s, as she again tried to, go on a diet and lose weight. Moving on to the artist Carrie Mae Weems. Carrie Mae Weems also joins photographic image and text. Her series of images form constructed narratives that reveal cultural mythologies about identity and relationships. As Robert Hirsch asserts, her methodology has a persistent political resonance without being didactic. In one work, Weems uses 3 photographs of a young African-American man to interrogate stereotypes of blacks as socially powerless and invisible. Mocking the old adage, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, the man covers his eyes, then his ears, then his mouth. The artist herself explained, quote, I want to make things that are beautiful, seductive, formally challenging, and culturally meaningful. I'm also committed to radical social change. Any form of human injustice moves me deeply. The battle against all forms of oppression keeps me going and keeps me focused. And here's her beautiful image. See no evils. All right, and our last photographer for this lecture is Shireen Nishat. Shireen Nishat's photographs explore the role of women in Islam. She was born in Iran in 1948. She immigrated to the U.S. as a teenager, and after a 1990 trip back to her home country, she was compelled to begin a series of photographic images expressing her contradictory feelings about her exile. She began by photographing her face, her hands and feet, the part of the female body exposed when Islamic women wear the chador, and then writing over the flesh in Farsi. In a later series, she also posed her figures carrying guns. And this is her image called Rebellious Silence. And now we are very familiar with Shireen Nishat as an artist, but in 1994, when she first showed these pictures, people were very concerned because they saw the Farsi written on the model's face. In this case, the model is the artist herself. And they didn't know, they saw the gun, and they didn't know whether the artist was saying, what she was saying with the Farsi. Was she, encouraging people to violence, or was she not? And now we understand that the Farsi, a lot of times that's written on these beautiful photographs, is poetry. So it might be the poet Rumi, or, it's very lyrical and poetic imagery. within the last, I don't know, 3 years or 2 years, Shireen Nishat had a big show at the Broad, and so you should find lots of material on her online if you're interested in exploring a little bit more about her. All right, you guys, thanks very much. This is the end of our lecture.